a social experiment was conducted in Washington, D.C. Now, I'm not 100% certain, but I don't think that this was the first of its kind. But what I do know is this, that since that time, there have been many other people who have repeated the kind of experiment that this was. And I believe that many others will continue to do so because, well, it's just incredibly interesting. The Washington Post was the organization that arranged and funded this experiment. And it goes like this. A man walks into the metro train station and positions himself against a wall, close to a trash can. He is nondescript. He's a younger white man with blue jeans, long-sleeve t-shirt, and a baseball cap. From a small case, he takes out a violin. He places the open case at his feet. He throws in a couple of dollars and some change as seed money. And then he turns to face the pedestrian traffic and starts to play. This all took place on a Friday morning in January during the middle of the morning commute. In the next 43 minutes, the violinist performed 6 classical pieces. 1,097 people passed by because this was recorded, and people were able to then assess kind of how people reacted. Almost all of them were on their way to work, presumably government jobs. Each commuter had a quick choice to make, one that is pretty familiar to anybody who commutes in a large urban area where there are street performers. Do you actually stop and listen, or do you hurry past and not make eye contact? Do you throw in $1 to be polite, and does your decision change if the person playing is really bad? What if he's or she's really good? Does that affect your decision? So on that Friday in January, these questions were answered in a very public way. No one knew it, but the violinist standing against the wall was one of the best classical musicians in the world, playing some of the most elegant music ever written on one of the most expensive violins ever made. And the question was this: in an ordinary setting, at an inconvenient time, would people notice? Would beauty transcend? Would people hear it? This musician did not play popular tunes because that would have drawn an interest. That wasn't part of the experiment. That was not the test. Instead, what was played were masterpieces that have endured for centuries on their brilliance alone. Music that would be appropriate in cathedrals and in concert halls. So Joshua Bell was the musician for this experiment, an internationally acclaimed genius. So 3 days before this took place, he appeared at the Boston Symphony Hall, where he packed out the seats. And an average ticket, an okay ticket, went for over $100. 2 weeks later, after this experiment, he played for a standing room only audience that was so respectful of his craft that they stifled their coughs until the silence between the movements. But on that Friday in January, Joshua Bell was just another street performer competing for the attention of busy people on their way to work. Is anybody familiar with this story? Did you read this? It was about 10 years ago. Warren did, a couple of you did? Okay. Well, what do you think happened? Maybe you could even guess. So I'm going to just play this video clip in the background. This is part of the original video that they did as part of this. Joshua is going to be in the left-hand corner as you're watching this. That leaves about 1,070 people who hurried by at pace. At the end of this experiment, the writer who was doing this had one question. If we can't take the time out of our lives to stay a moment and listen to one of the best musicians on earth play some of the best music ever written, if the surge of modern life so overpowers us that we are deaf and blind to something like that, well, then what else are we missing? And that's the question. What else are we missing? It's a great question. And while this entire experiment is not meant to make a religious point, nonetheless, it does. It does speak directly to our faith as Christians, and it helps us make sense of John the Baptist's question to Jesus. Are you the one? If you were here last week, maybe you recall that we read another reading about John the Baptist. Last week, John was on the bank of the Jordan River calling people to repent, or to literally reorient themselves, to turn around and to be baptized in preparation for the one who was coming after him. The John that we heard last week, he was a fire and brimstone kind of prophet who proclaimed Jesus coming. That John that we heard last week was fearless as he drew in crowds and insulted religious leaders to their faces. That John was a visionary, scouring the banks of the Jordan with his call for a new way of living. The John we read about last week was impressive. He was confident. He was strong. And now today, we hear an entirely different person. The same John as last week is now in a very, very different place in life. He is pacing in a small cell and wondering if he has made a mistake with his life, if he has wasted his life's work. And so, desperate for some validation, he sends a messenger to ask a question as simple as it is important. Are you the one? Apparently, John was no longer certain that the one he spoke so highly of was as good as he thought, was the one sent by God. And in this exchange, Jesus refuses to give a straightforward answer. He doesn't say yes, he doesn't say no. Instead, he says, pay attention. Look around you. See what's going on. Tell John that the blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor have good news brought to them. And I wonder actually how John took Jesus' answer. Yes, it's an impressive list, but it also assumes that John did not know these things about Jesus. And I think that is highly unlikely. Of course he knows. So instead, another way to read this portion is like this. It is precisely because John knows what Jesus is doing that he is having doubts and second thoughts about who Jesus is. Maybe the fiery and radical John that we met earlier was looking for something more than what he had been hearing and seeing in Jesus. It would not be surprising at all if John was like many others before him and after him that expected God to send a liberator, somebody with a sword and strength who would help Israel, God's chosen people, regain their freedom and independence, or at the very least, send a charismatic leader who would rally all of God's people together in a frenzy and take back what was theirs. That was the promise that so many people hung on to. It's what they were looking forward to. It's what they expected. But it's not what they got. Jesus did not come repeating John's warning about looming judgment on God's people. He came proclaiming instead the breaking in of God's kingdom for the least, the last, and the lost. And all of this came about through non-violent means, through service and self-sacrificial love. John was simply expecting something different. Hence the question, are you the one? And that question is also for us today. I don't think we're any different than John. So what do you expect, honestly? As the Joshua Bell experiment revealed, we expect to find incredible music in appropriate places, like music halls and auditoriums and stadiums, but what about on the street? Will you even notice? We expect to find great works of art in museums and art galleries because that's where we're told to go look for it at, right? But what about those things hanging on the wall of a local restaurant or on the refrigerator of a proud mom? Will we even see it? We expect to hear or maybe even experience God in churches, places like this, maybe in some youth groups, maybe on a mission trip or two. But what about in the daily grind of your everyday existence? What about in your job, in your families? What about in your community, in those places and events that are not here, that are far removed from here? Will we even notice God in the very ordinary places of life? And so my question for us today is this: do our expectations prevent us from experiencing God in the day-to-day life that we live? So let me tell you a quick story. This was years ago. After a wedding rehearsal, people were standing around and they were telling stories. And one of the groomsmen started telling this joke. And about halfway through this joke, he stops. I mean, he looks around like this and kind of like has a realization and simply stops. And he goes, "Oh, I can't finish this here. Not in church. It's a dirty joke. It's not appropriate. Let's go outside." So, two things about that. First, I wanted to hear it, and I wasn't invited to go. So I missed out. Story of my life. But secondly, apparently, this area that we are sitting in right now, in this space, this is holy space, but the minute you walk out the door, it's not. God is here, not out there, according to many people. I don't know what your expectations are. Some people turn away or leave communities like this because they have very specific expectations that go unmet. Some people give up on the whole notion of God because they are taught certain things from their childhood that end up not panning out. Their expectations for God aren't met. John suffered from a very limited vision, brought on by expectations of what should happen. And honestly, I think a lot of churches and Christians can suffer from the same thing. Our expectations of what we do, of who God is and where God is at, or maybe it's our lack of expectations sometimes that prevents us from being creative in our ministries. It prevents us from reaching out and participating fully in what God is already doing in the world because we can't see what God is doing in the world. So as we prepare for Christmas in this season of Advent, be aware that God always lives outside of your expectations. One of the great things about the Christmas story that we will hear and focus on in just a week and a half is that our expectations of who God is and what God is about are absolutely challenged. That is the point of the Christmas story. And that is great news because it brings life to us in places that we would never expect it. And so this holiday season, in this season of Advent, my challenge and encouragement to you today is this: Slow yourself down to see the unexpected. Train yourself to look for God in those places where you do not expect to find it, in places where love, grace, mercy, and peace can be found. For when you do, you will find that God is indeed not far away, but very, very, very near, closer than we ever have imagined. This is the good news that we hear this morning. Thanks be to God for that. Amen.